along so that we'll have lots of time to hear from Dan and Larry and questions and answers at the end. So let me first of all read you their bios, all right? I think most of you already know their bios, but if you don't, you're going to know a little more. Dan Wilcox is the host of the third Thursday Poetry Night at the Social Justice Center in Albany. He's also a member of the poetry performance group, Three Guys from Albany. As a photographer, he claims to have the world's largest collection of photos of unknown poets. He's been a featured reader at all the important poetry venues in the Capital District and throughout the Hudson Valley. He's an active member of Veterans for Peace. After graduating from college, Dan was drafted in 1969. Although trained as a tank driver, he was in the lucky half of his training class and was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky. He was a member of the American Servicemen's Union. And he's also written several books. I went through my extensive collection at home. Found one book with a poem, several poems by Dan, and he's going to read a poem for us tonight. So, but there's several other books if you're interested. Let me just tell you a little bit about Larry. Larry Whitner is professor of history emeritus.
No, emeritus.
Emeritus, sorry. I knew that. and he began his career as a peace activist in the fall of 1969. I cut off the edge here.
1961.
Of 1961. Oh, this is bad. I cut off the edge of the paper.
Oh, well.
Okay, so you're going to have to fill in the blanks.
You can cut it down, but not that way.
Too bad. Do you know what this says? Maybe you could just tell everybody.
All right.
All right.
Did you cut off the left edge or the right?
All right, I'll try to reconstruct this. I began my career as a peace activist in the fall of 1961 when I circled the White House in a demonstration attempting to block resumption of nuclear testing. Since then, I've participated in a great many peace movement activities, and I've also been a leader of the Peace History Society, of the Peace History Commission of the International Peace Research Association, and a national board member of Peace Action. I'm currently involved in, I'm the executive secretary of the Albany County Edwardsville CIO. I've written about 13 books, 4 of them edited, including Rebels Against War, Peace Action, and a trilogy called The Struggle Against the Bomb. I've spoken in a wide number of places, including here in the Capital District, but also at the UN and at the Norwegian Nobel Institute.
Thank you, Larry. I also brought a few of Larry's books. There's another one back there, but I think the one people probably won't remember, the most recent one, is What's Going On at the U of R, which is satire.
Right, a satire on the corporate university.
And the other books I'll put back on the table if anyone wants to take a look. But anyway, forgive me for that.
That's fine.
I also, there's a book here that I mentioned about Dan, and Dan has these for sale. This is a little pamphlet of poems that Dan wrote, and he's going to read one out of this, and he'll also sell you a copy for $1. Okay. So anyway, so I'll get out of the way here and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you. So the way this is going to work, is I'm going to speak first. I'll give you a little short general background, then I'll talk about the program that we went to called The Power of Protest in D.C. in the early part of the month. And then Larry will talk to you about his trip to Vietnam, which was part of the same project. And we both have slides, and at some point, Trudy will work the slides. I don't need you just yet. So I thought I'd give you a little general background about why this happened, why this conference happened, and Larry's trip to Vietnam. I'm going to read you just a paragraph that came out of the material. There's a lot of information about this event on lessonsofvietnam.org. Lessonsofvietnam.org. If you go there, you'll see biographies of all the speakers. You'll see the program listing, and there's a question and answer thing. And the first question and the question and answer says, what is Vietnam, the power of protest? The Pentagon has a 10-year plan funded by a $60 million appropriation from Congress that, in the guise of honoring Vietnam-era veterans on the 50th anniversary of the war, may also rewrite the history of the war. Some of us have gotten together to push back, as reported in the front page article in the New York Times in October. We have to build a strong and sustained effort to tell the truth about the war, the role of the anti-war movement in ending it, the war's lessons for today, and the war's consequences for the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians, as well as many American veterans. Vietnam, the power of protest, is the kickoff for this effort. And so, 1965 is the, 2015 is the 50th anniversary of the 1965, 50th anniversary of the 1965 start of the Vietnam War. It's also the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. So we've got 10 years of this stuff in front of us, all right, with the Pentagon supposedly taking the lead. There's a good article about that in this issue of The Nation, which came out on May 4th by John Wiener, called Vietnam in the Battlefield of Memory. And I'll read you a paragraph from that that really summarizes what happened. When the Pentagon announced this plan, and a number of people noticed it, peace historians, historians in general who are just concerned about the truth of history, activists like Tom Hayden, and the article in the New York Times was in October 9th of 2014, talking about their reaction to the Pentagon publishing this material on their website, including a proposed curriculum for schools for teaching the history of Vietnam. Almost 1,500 people signed a petition against this. Most of them noted historians and activists. Now, the Pentagon has abandoned its plans to develop educational and classroom materials. So the petition worked. They backed off. After meeting with Hayden, for us. Yeah. After meeting with Hayden and 5 other leaders of the committee in January, a Pentagon official declared in a March 19th email that the Defense Department was shifting its mission from, quote, education and history to much more limited one of thanking and honoring Vietnam veterans for their service and sacrifice. The official also pledged that the much criticized interactive timeline on the Pentagon's website would be replaced, and asked the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee, which is the group that decided to call itself, to suggest historians who could help with an independent review of the revised version. So we had a small victory, but as everything in government, you must be aware it can change. You know, they could appoint someone new in charge, we could have a new president that could change this, lots of things could change it. So we have to be vigilant. But we had a success, and it prompted these folks to organize this event that was in D.C. at the beginning of the month, and Larry's trip as sort of a start of the kind of things that we need to do. I'm going to read the last paragraph of this article. It's not so much about the conference that we were at, but I think it's a good analysis of what's going on. Wiener says, a modest proposal. This year, on the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the war, instead of saying thank you to the vets, we should say, we're sorry. We're sorry you were sent to fight in an unjust and futile war. We're sorry you were lied to. We're sorry you lost comrades and years of your own lives, and that you suffered the after effects for so many years. We're sorry the VA has done such a terrible job in taking care of you. On the other hand, we might say thank you to the people who worked to end the war and ask them to tell us about their experience. So that's basically what that's about. Now, look around this audience. I mean, you're the people that we say thank you to. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, were involved in the anti-Vietnam protests at the time. And you look very much like the audience that was down there in Washington on May 1st and 2nd. Yes, the elders. So this is I'll read you 3 items from the statement that they issued with the program in D.C. It says, fighting on the battlefield of memory, lessons from the Vietnam War. And the first item is, the Vietnam peace movement must be remembered as having shaken our country to its foundations and for defending democracy against secrecy and bureaucratic tyranny. There are many in power today who want us to forget that the peace movement even existed. These are the same people who want us to forget that America lost the war and who are urging more military involvement in war today. And at the end of these 2 statements, the peace movement helped end the war, brought down 2 presidents, and saved many people from unnecessary death and suffering. Those who worked to stop the war deserve credit in American history for attempting to save the nation from a gross injustice and grave national error. That movement, which Howard Zinn called the greatest anti-war movement the nation ever experienced, must not be erased from history nor vilified as having been a stab in the back. Many who served in the military also opposed the war. Anti-war voices should be recognized and heard in national security forums and in the media today. The Vietnam peace movement was marked by internal divisions and sectarian strife that weakened its unity, future potential, and public image and legacy. The peace movement should be remembered for its rainbow character and diversity of approaches from resistors to electoral campaigners. We must do for the future what we often failed to do before. Unite ourselves in a common democratic movement towards peace and justice. We need greater alliances across race, gender, and class lines, and internationally, to build true peace majorities that are stronger because they are more diverse. That's the general tone of that conference that I attended. And it was inspirational. You know, all the heroes were there. The figures that you saw in the news, the ones that are still living. And there are quite a few that are still living. Be thankful. In their 80s and 90s, and there was even someone in the audience who, I didn't know his name, but Tom Hayden called him out at one point. He was 100 years old sitting in the audience, and he stood up and took a bow. So it was wonderful to do that. So it was held here at this church, the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, D.C. All right, should we go to the next one? That just gives you a little bit of an idea of the room. It was a large church sanctuary. I don't know how many people it held, quite a few hundred. It could be as much as 1,000 with the balcony spaces. I'm not sure how many people attended. I'm standing maybe about 6 rows back here, and there were many rows behind me. But that's the kind of setup that it was held in. Okay, next one. One of the great things about it is that if you turned around, and I will show you some other slides later on, in the audience, a lot of the folks, the celebrities, were in the audience too. They didn't just show up. That's Holly Near, standing there. She was like sitting right behind me right when I first sat down. So, and I'll show you some other pictures of other folks like that. So that was a great thing about it. That, while they were honoring the celebrities on stage, everyone else was in the audience, and we all shared in the honor. Okay, the next one. This is Barbara Lee, a representative from California, and she was one of the early speakers in that first night where we honored the elders. I don't think I have a good quote from her. All right, next slide. Okay, Peter Yarrow was there providing a little entertainment. That's him singing with his daughter and his daughter's husband. All right, next one. Now, this is the elders that we saw there that night that were honored. And the host, or the MC, was Phil Donahue. You can see on the left, that white hair. It was Phil Donahue. And he said a very interesting anecdote about one of the first peace demonstrations that he was at. He saw this old guy, older than the students who were being arrested. A lot of young people were being arrested and taken away in police cars. And he saw this old guy in what looked like a very expensive suit, also being taken away. And it was Benjamin Spock. So, and that impressed him as a reporter at the time, and in many ways that expressed the character of what happened this night. This is the first night, Friday night. Each of these elders, and I'll give you the names in a minute, were introduced by a younger 30 or 40-something activist. And one of the themes that ran through the whole conference was, some people would say, oh, where are the young people? Okay? And I look around the room, and most of us are pretty much on the far end of the age spectrum. But where are the young people? In the 60s, there were not that many nonprofit organizations working on social justice issues. I'm using that in the broadest term possible. And not a lot of advocacy lawyers. Now, they're all over the place. I mean, if you go on your computer and you're in any kind of thing, you get hits from all kinds of organizations, some you never even heard of before, but are working on, on gender issues, immigrant rights issues, racism, poverty. That's a legacy of the 60s. And that, to a large degree, is where a lot of these young people are. They're working for these organizations that are making changes in whatever their particular area is. Wage justice, anything, you name it, women's rights, there are people, and that's what all these young people who introduce the elders, that's kind of organizations they work for. So just point out who they are. They're all seated down here in a row, and starting from the left, the fellow in the purple is Arthur Waskow. He's a rabbi. I wasn't familiar with his name, but interesting enough, when I got home and put the photos up on my Flickr site, my sister-in-law lives in Philly. She says, oh, I know him. He's very active in environmental issues right now in Philadelphia, and he was a founding resident fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies. And in March 1965, he was a keynote speaker at the first anti-war teach-in at the University of Michigan. So he's a person now over in his 80s who activism very like that. Seating next to him is Scott Lynn. And you'll recognize that name, so he's still around. He chaired the first Washington demonstration against the war in April of 1990. Moving on, next to him is Marcus Raskin. You know the name Marcus Raskin? Okay. Marcus Raskin, he was also a founder of the Institute for Policy Studies. And in 1968, he was indicted with William Sloane Coffin and Benjamin Spock, Michael Ferber, and Mitchell Goodman for conspiring to aid resistance to the draft. All right? Thank you. These people are still around. Next to him, George Regas. George Regas is director of the Regas Institute, which organizes and advocates for progressive religions that speak out about war and social justice issues, gender equality, gay justice, and he is active in opposition to the Vietnam War. Next to him is Cora Weiss, and she had an interesting quote. She said, "The time has come to tell war to go." All right? We have to get serious about teaching peace. And she represented Women's Strikes for Peace, organized in November 1969 demonstration in D.C., and was a co-director with Dave Dillinger in the Committee of Liaison that arranged for monthly exchange of mail for prisoners in North Vietnam in the 60s. Next to her is Judith Lerner, And she was a founding member in 1961 of Women's Strike for Peace, and she traveled to Vietnam in 1971. She also worked on Bella Abzug's Senate race. And a couple people celebrated Bella Abzug there too, so most of us will remember her as a grand lady activist that left us too soon. Next to her is David McReynolds. And David McReynolds, I love David McReynolds' remarks, being a poet myself. He referenced, he referenced Allen Ginsberg, one of the poets that touches me very deeply, and he talked about, discussed the morality of some of our great peacemakers, Dorothy Day, Dan Berrigan, and A.J. Muste. And next to him is they're not in order on my program, so I had to develop the numbers to figure out where they were. Okay. Oh, that was George. That's George Regas. Okay. Oh, and on the end we have Daniel Ellsberg. So he was there and he spoke too. So, and I misidentified one person. The person in fourth from the left is actually Dick Fernandez, a clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam in 1966. He was the first director of that. So, this was the elders, and it was thrilling to see them all. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, these are the two of the organizers of this event. On the left is Marge Tabakin and Heather Booth, both with long histories and working both against the Vietnam War and then on other issues in the years since. And what was telling to me was that, you know, we have these celebrities, but there's also other people who are celebrities within the movement. You know, and they may not be known to people who read the New York Times and they see, you know, Daniel Ellsberg on the front page of the New York Times. But these are the people, and the audience was filled with those people, as the audience is filled here today with us, of the, I don't want to say unknowns, but the lesser knowns, you know, and the people that we are doing the day-to-day work in the movement to keep these issues alive. During the Vietnam War, organized marches and other events, and now for all the other issues, the environmental issues, the gender issues, all the justice issues, wage issues, everything that we're working on today. Okay, next. So the next day, on Saturday, we had a full day on Saturday. This is Juan Gonzalez, who served as a moderator for a panel discussion called What We Did, Why, and Who We Were. Okay, next one. And there's Tom Hayden, who's a force behind this whole thing, and he was there the whole time. What a speaker. He is marvelous to listen to, and a very interesting, humorous, just good to hear. Okay, next. This fellow was a guy by the name of Wayne Smith. I didn't know about him before. But he described going into the Army in the early 60s and how naive he was and how then his mind was changed. And in a way, he stands for so many of the GIs that served and then became disillusioned, or shall we say, illuminated about what the war was really about while they were in there, and then carried on the struggle both while they were in the military and afterwards while they were out. And then these are the four panel discussions. Tom Hayden, Wayne Smith, Ron Dellums, he was a member of Congress from Oakland. And next to him is Pat Schroeder, who actually took over his seat. These folks were early anti-war members of Congress who spoke out courageously at a time when they were a very tiny minority. Pat Schroeder was great. She was like a stand-up comic. She would tell the funniest stories about being in Congress and talking to people. It was just wonderful. And these folks are full of energy still. And it was good to see them. Okay, next one. All right, so they had 2 breakout sessions. One of the breakout sessions, there were 14 different choices. You can only pick one. And the other breakout session, there were 8 choices. Then again, they're loaded. So this is the one that, one of the 14, the first I went to, called Vietnam Era Authors and Poets. And the fellow speaking with the mic is a fellow by the name of Jan Barry, who I've been in poetry readings with Veterans for Peace, particularly down in Teaneck, New Jersey, at the Public Library. And sitting in the middle is W.T. Earhart, very well known. People who know poetry know him just as a poet, but he writes a lot about the Vietnam. They were involved in putting out an important anthology called Winning Hearts and Minds that they put out as a small press book, and then it was picked up by Macmillan a number of years ago. I think it's still in print and it's taught in some schools. And then next to him is another author by the name of John Ketling. 2 things I want to mention about that. Interesting places to go for information on current writing by veterans, warriorwriters.org and combatpapers.org. Combat Papers is interesting because the soldiers turn their uniforms into paper and into art projects with the papers. So then, okay, next one. All right, this is the other session that I attended. Now some of these had, had celebrities in them. I mean, apparently Bernadine Dorn was there. I didn't know what she looked like now, so I didn't recognize her. Mark Rudd is another name that you may recognize. He was there. Again, I didn't identify him. So, I think Todd Gitlin, people like that, they're more well known. I think they were very well attended. Even so, we had about 15 people at this particular workshop. It was moderated by a young activist named Stephen Miles, who works for Win Without War. Again, moving from left to right. The next person over is Rayed Jarar, who is an Iraqi who works for American Friends Service Committee. Next to him is Joe Comerford from MoveOn.org. Next to her is Jody Evans from Code Pink. Next to her is Leslie Kagan. She works on a lot of different issues. Right now, I think she's focusing on a lot of gender issues. And then on the end is Michael McPherson from Veterans for Peace. Veterans for Peace has a similar project to this project. It's called the Full Disclosure Project for Veterans for Peace. So if you go to veteransforpeace.org, you can see more information about that. All right, next one. So there again, back in the audience, this is Elizabeth Holtzman. Remember her? She was a ran for Congress in like 1972, I believe. Anti-war candidate. Yep, there she was in the audience. Okay, next. Oh, anybody know who that is? Yeah. Julian Bond. Yeah, Julian Bond was there. He spoke a number of times, and again, sitting in the audience right behind me, it was great to see. He walked by me at one point, and I just went up to, I said hello to him, and he reached down, and he shook my hand, he says, "Nice to see you." Okay. Nice to see you too. It was great. All right, next slide. Oh, and then, so then we went on a march. Amy Goodman, yep. Went on a march from where we were to the Martin Luther King Memorial, about 1.5 miles. And so this is just before I happened to spot Amy Goodman, who had been in the audience earlier, just talking to somebody, probably saying, "I love your show," whatever. Okay, next. There's the wall. That's one wall. There's 2 huge walls at the Martin Luther King Memorial with different quotes from him. Okay, next. There's the audience. It was hot and sunny. It was beautiful down, about 80 degrees. It got really good. Okay, next. That's Danny Glover introducing the speakers at the Martin Luther King thing. All right, next. So in the evening, after the Martin Luther King visit, there was a dinner, and the dinner was Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese food. And there were representatives from the Cambodian, Laotian, and Vietnamese embassies there, each of whom spoke. thanking us, not for destroying their countries, but for the work of the peacemakers and for stopping the war, and for the work that we're doing now, which I'm sure Larry will get into. And the opening remarks were by John McAuliffe, who led Larry's trip. And then for the final program of the evening, Amy Goodman was the MC. Okay, next. And here we have, these folks were around the whole time. Holly Neer on the left, and then Emma's Revolution. Those of you in the music, they're all over the place singing for lots of causes and stuff. And none of it was too long. I'll say that before I quit, very quickly. They ran a very, very tight ship, and nothing went beyond time, and they just kept it moving. And boy, I tell you, that was great. All right, next, one more. Two more. Oh, this Luis Rodriguez. He was from Oakland, and he was a Chicano activist during the war, and he had wonderful stories about being in jail. All right, next. And these two women presented a translation of the biography of Madame Bin, who was with the NLF. She was on the peace of when they negotiated the peace in Paris. Madame Bin was one of the representatives, and these two women are Judy Gumbo and Randy Ross, and they presented a new translation of that book that's just come out. And this is a singer, he's a former GI, David Morris. I happened to talk to him the night before because he had an interesting beret on. So I got talking to him, and he had a great story. All right, and the last slide, and so here's the closing ceremony with lots of the folks on stage and everything. So it was a combination of talks, and a combination of music, and food, and it was inspiring, and I've only given you about half of the information that I could have about this. If you want to talk to me at some time after or during the questions and answers, I'll be glad to tell you some more about it. You wanted the poem, but I'm running along. I want to do everything. All right?
If we have time, you can do it at the end.
Okay. All right. All right. During the last 2 weeks of April, I traveled to Vietnam with a small group of people who were, as Dan mentioned, peace activists during the Vietnam War era. This delegation was organized by the same Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee that sponsored the Washington Conference, and led by John McAuliffe, who also spoke there. The tour group, oh, there it is, all right. The tour group can be seen here near Ho Chi Minh's mausoleum, up to your left there. And that's where his body is preserved, much like Lenin's body is preserved in Moscow. And you can walk by his bier there, as we did, with armed guards all around. We met with Vietnamese government officials. Okay. Here's one such meeting. We met with the U.S. ambassador, a fellow named Ted Osius. Here we are in the embassy residence. We met with U.S.-Vietnam friendship associations around the country. And we visited museums, hospitals, schools, factories, and sites contaminated by Agent Orange and unexploded ordnance, which is landmines, shells, and cluster bombs. In general, we witnessed a remarkable revival of the nation in the 40 years since a brutal war devastated the country. Changing of the guard here.
Yeah, request to dim the lights. People
Oh,
said
all
they
right.
couldn't see.
All right. Cities are bustling with energy and thriving. Hordes of motorbikes are crowding their streets. 4.2 million motorbikes in Hanoi. All right. I think that's not the Hanoi picture. I don't know what happened to it. There it is. Crossing streets, you face this phalanx of motorbikes coming fast down the street towards you. And in Ho Chi Minh City, 7 million. The economy is booming, and for the past decade, Vietnam has had one of the highest rates of economic growth around the world. Giant foreign companies, banks, major corporations, and businesses are conspicuous in the cities, and about 40% of the economy is capitalist. Cities are undergoing rapid economic growth with luxury restaurants and luxury goods available. For example, Ho Chi Minh City. One picture. That one and the next one. We're on the balcony, but going on is a street light below us. You've gone too far. Manufacturing is developing rapidly with special enterprise zones. Here's a government enterprise called Garco 10, which turns out high-end clothing for foreign markets. You can see the workers working in this government factory. And while we didn't visit any private factories, my guess is they're roughly like this. And you can show the next one too. See workers working away there. The face masks are common in factories there, but they're common on the streets too. Thanks to pollution, and they're common in China and Japan as well, by the way. So many Asians today go around with these face masks on to safeguard themselves from particulate in the air, thanks to rapid industrialization. Workers here, I should note, are paid on a piece rate basis. Tourism. Yeah. Tourism and agriculture are major growth engines as well. Vietnam, which imported rice during the Vietnam War, is now the second largest rice exporter in the world, and one of the world's largest exporters of coffee, pepper, rubber, cashews, and other agricultural commodities. The American War, as it's called in Vietnam, seems like an incredibly, or an increasingly distant memory to many Vietnamese. Of course, there are museums with powerful exhibits on the horrors of the war. But to many Vietnamese, this is just history rather than a lived experience. One reason for this historical amnesia is the fact that most of the population was born after the war came to an end. Vietnam's population, 41 million in 1975, when the war came to an end, has more than doubled, and today tops 90 million. The Vietnamese public is therefore very youthful. School children. Nonetheless, the people of Vietnam paid a very heavy price for their independence from foreign domination. Some 3 million Vietnamese died in the American War, and another 300,000 are still classified as missing in action. Additionally, many Vietnamese were wounded or crippled in the conflict, and one sees many prosthetic devices on people who are missing limbs or arms. And the nightmare continues today. During the war, the U.S. military used enormous quantities of Agent Orange, dioxin, as a defoliant. Vietnamese officials estimate that today some 4 million Vietnamese suffer the terrible effects of this chemical, which not only destroys the bodies of those exposed to it, but has led to horrible birth defects and development disabilities into the second and now the third generation. Here's one woman. She's in her 30s, I believe, but you'll notice her twisted legs that are not fully developed. Here's a young man in his 30s, and he's always on his back. His limbs are buckled under him, as you can see where his legs are, and he's totally a total invalid, with his family taking care of him. And here's a young child. I found this one of the grimmest pictures I'd seen. We didn't see this child ourselves, but it's exhibited in one of the war museums. Despite cleanup efforts, much of Vietnam's land remains contaminated by Agent Orange. The land is also strewn with unexploded ordnance. Here's some being exhibited at one of the sites, but clearly these are not buried, ready to be stepped on by children or adults in the fields just walking down the road. Indeed, since the end of the war, more than 105,000 Vietnamese, many of them children, have been wounded or killed by landmines, shells, and bombs that continue to litter the nation's soil. Here's a bomb that was found there, a cluster bomb. Notice the little cluster bombs and this bigger bomb that would be strewn had this exploded. And little children seeing these little ball-like things in fields or on the roads pick them up, and they'll sometimes explode, sending thousands of steel pellets through the air into their bodies and elsewhere. Here's one of the wounded from unexploded ordnance. He's missing his legs, as you notice. Something that happened to him as a child when he stepped on a landmine with a shell. Here's a picture of yet another victim that's exhibited as a cautionary tale. And in fact, one of the sites we went to where children had lost limbs or were being treated for Agent Orange contamination or birth defects, children will often draw pictures for other children to be exhibited in their schools, warning them not to go over to these shells or something some metal piece they see sticking out of the soil. So it's a common thing to have these pictures exhibited in the schools, warning children not to step on landmines and not to go near these shells. During the immediate post-war years, Vietnam's ruin was exacerbated by additional factors. These included a U.S. government embargo on trade with Vietnam, U.S. government efforts to isolate Vietnam diplomatically, and the 1979 Chinese military invasion of Vietnam that employed 600,000 troops and led to massive death and destruction only 4 years after the American War came to an end. The Vietnamese somehow managed to expel the Chinese just as they had previously routed the French and the Americans. Additionally, during the first post-war decade, the ruling Vietnamese Communist Party pursued a hardline repressive policy that undermined what was left of the economy after the American War and alienated much of the population. Misery and starvation were rampant. Nonetheless, starting in the mid-1980s, the country made a remarkable comeback. This recovery was facilitated by Communist Party reformers who loosened the reins of power encouraged foreign investment, and worked at developing a friendlier relationship with other nations, especially the United States. In 1995, during the Clinton administration, the U.S. and Vietnamese governments resumed diplomatic relations. Though I should note that the State Department told the new U.S. ambassador that he must never mention the words Agent Orange. We were told this, by the way, by the new U.S. ambassador, today's ambassador. He said things have really changed now, but back then, back in 1995, the ambassador was told never mention those words. Vietnam's circumstances, and especially its relationship with the United States, gradually improved. U.S.-Vietnamese trade expanded very substantially, reaching $35 billion in 2014. Thousands of Vietnamese students participated in educational exchanges. Many Vietnamese who had gone into exile overseas began to return to Vietnam to visit, to establish a permanent residence there once more, or to make financial investments. And in recent years, the U.S. government has even begun funding programs to help clean up Agent Orange contamination and unexploded ordnance. These are long-term programs, though, and they won't be completed for many years. Most of the work thus far, in fact, has been done by NGOs, by non-governmental humanitarian organizations. Though in part, this U.S.-Vietnamese warming of relations, this détente, resulted from the growing flexibility of officials in both nations. Recently, it has also reflected the apprehension of both governments about the increasingly assertive posture of China in Asian affairs. Worried about China's unilateral occupation of uninhabited islands and reefs in the South China Sea, what the Vietnamese call the East Sea, they don't refer to China in that sense, during 2014, both governments began to resist it. The United States, through its so-called Pacific Pivot, and Vietnam through an ever closer relationship with the United States to balance China. Though both nations officially support the settlement of the conflict over the disputed islands through diplomacy centered on the 10 countries that comprise the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, officials in Vietnam, increasingly nervous about China's ambitions, appear to welcome the growth of a more powerful U.S. military presence in Asia. They also seem eager to purchase heavy U.S. military weaponry. Vietnam is still on the list of countries that are barred from officially purchasing U.S. military equipment. But given the fact that they'd like to do so, they've been lobbying to get themselves taken off that list. In the context of this emerging agreement on regional security, U.S. Ambassador Osius, and here he is talking to us once more with his aides to his left, is extraordinarily friendly toward the Vietnamese government, as he was toward us. He wined and dined with us there. There will be a visit to Vietnam later this year by Secretary of State John Kerry, Secretary of Defense Ashton Carter, and President Barack Obama, all this year. This shift over the past 40 years from warring enemies to cooperative partners should inspire some solemn reflection. In the Vietnam War, the U.S. government laid waste to a poor peasant nation in an effort to prevent the triumph of a communist revolution that U.S. officials insisted would result in a red tide that ultimately would sweep over the shores of California. And yet, when the U.S. government's bloody military project failed and the revolutionaries came to power, this did not happen. There was no red tide. There was no revolution that moved on to the U.S. mainland. Instead, an independent nation emerged that could and did work amicably with the U.S. government. This development highlights the unnecessary nature, indeed the tragedy, of America's vastly disruptive war in Vietnam. It also raises questions about relying on war to cope with international issues. The war's aftermath also raises some questions about the Vietnamese Revolution. The 40th anniversary celebration of Vietnamese victory in the American War and the subsequent reunification of the country, scheduled for April 30th, 2015, was widely heralded throughout the nation. Here's one of many, many signs that were going up around the country that we saw. Again, you notice the motorbikes parked out in front. The centerpiece of this celebration was a spectacular parade in downtown Ho Chi Minh City, attended by our peace activist delegation as honored guests. We were in the reviewing stand. Filled with red flags, it was a carefully choreographed Communist Party production, replete with marching social constituencies, factory workers, electricians, construction workers, and so on, all in colorful outfits for the occasion, and large numbers of soldiers chanting and marching perfectly in step. And here we'll see a number of pictures, one by one. Did we miss that first one? Did we miss it? Oh, there. There are the red flags. The official flag is the yellow star on the red background. But there you see other typical communist flags that have been sickle as this group marches forward. One of many, many, many groups. We were there for 4.5 hours watching this parade and listening to official speeches in Vietnamese. And here we see a more colorful semi-dance. They're running by us. We're in this reviewing stand that you see in the lower right corner there. But the paraders are going by. Oh, and in the background you can see the whole thing being televised or broadcast on these big screens in the background there. Here, I think police marching by, although I could be wrong, perhaps they're military. Again, waving the flag. Oh, and here are, I believe, workers to the left and happy factory workers to the right, marching by, all their colorful outfits, all marching in step, you'll notice, with loud music blaring in the background. And here are women troops, again with the rifles on their shoulders, pledged to defend the homeland against the Chinese, probably. Pretty. Here are some officers in their uniform whites. And here are some regular troops marching by. I've skipped many of the marchers with guns, and there's maneuvers with them all in step. But, oh, and you can see the higher level military officials in the background there being televised as they're saluting them as they march by. And well, wait a second, I think that's all for the time being. So the speeches of government and party leaders were appropriately militant, or the brief summaries for us seem to be quite militant. But one had to ask oneself, was the reality of modern-day Vietnam really what the tremendous sacrifices of the revolution were all about? Yes, Vietnam was a proud, unified, independent nation. but it was also a country with a growing corporate capitalist sector, with strong government support for the Trans-Pacific Partnership and foreign investment, with the advent of luxury goods and commensurate advertising, with a growing divergence between rich and poor, with an emerging alliance with U.S. military power, and with many citizen complaints about Communist Party corruption. When our delegation asked officials about the corruption, they conceded that it existed, but said that it was not as bad as in China. What would Uncle Ho, Ho Chi Minh, as he is fondly called, think about all of this? I suspect that Uncle Ho would also be wondering about how strangely things have turned out only 40 years after the war. So I'm going to stop here, and Dan and I will be happy. Okay. So, questions? Yes.
Dan, was the conference you went to, was it an invitation-only conference, or was it open to the public?
Oh, no, it was open to the, it was open to the public. I don't remember how I got it. It's one of these things that came online. I don't know whose list I was on. Interesting, when it first came out, I signed up right away. I knew I was going to go. And the registration fee was steep by some standards. It was about $100, not hugely amount, but it was. So, and I bought the lunch and I bought the dinner. And then a couple weeks later, I got another email saying that they got a lot of flack from people that it was too expensive and they may be excluding people due to the price. And they offered all of us, you could get your money refunded and then donate, pay what you want. I already paid the money, so it's already gone. So when I get down there and I'm picking up my badge, mine had a yellow ribbon on it. And the guy says, oh, he says, you must have given an extra contribution. Very surprised. But you get to sit in the preferred seating area, so it's like the first 5 rows. So I got to sit up front. Yeah, so I was first class. Yeah. But it was open to the public.
Yes.
Is there any discontent with workers without environmental controls in their workplaces? It looks like almost slave labor type thing going on, and wages that might not be what they would like to see them be, and environmental pollution with the masking, but what would be kind of like ramifications of that, of all the different diseases that are cropping up? And did you notice anything in regards to that and discontent amongst the people?
Generally speaking, we were carefully shepherded around. This didn't mean we were barred from speaking to other people, but we were speaking with the official friendship groups. We were speaking with government officials. We would speak with the directors of that Garco 10 factory, for example. So we didn't really get to have detailed or intimate conversations with average people, nor would average people necessarily want to tell us about their complaints. I mean, it is a dictatorship there. It's a fairly loose one, though, was my sense of things. But still, people would hesitate to complain too much to these Western strangers. They don't know who we are, and so on. Even so, we picked up some complaints from people occasionally. One fellow, for example, told us that just after the war, during that that period of hardline communist government, if you had wanted to go to the university, you were pretty much barred from doing so if you were Catholic. If you were Buddhist, maybe so, and if you were a communist, certainly. But he said that had changed in recent years, so the softer line had prevailed. I wouldn't say that the factories are slave labor places, but they're probably much like Western factories today, particularly in the maquiladoras, those export reprocessing places just south of the U.S. border. So they're not slave labor, and they're being paid by the piece rather than paid wages. And of course, piecework means that you have to work fairly fast to make a good day's pay, right? Or they'll just speed you up. They'll say, well, so many more. They'll lower your pay per piece, so you'll work more to get a decent pay for the day. So it's not a great system, and I suspect while many people are happy, and that's my guess, with the economic growth that has taken place, and being able to buy motorbikes and being able to invest more in their homes and having more food on the table, and there doesn't seem to be massive starvation there. Nonetheless, I suspect there are a lot of complaints that are not voiced to foreign visitors. Yeah.
How many people died in the war against the French as opposed to the Vietnam War?
I don't know, but I would think that's available information online, but a substantial number. I should note, by the way, that the Vietnamese don't have any particular animus toward the Americans. That is, they've been fighting for so many years against foreign invaders. They were ruled by China for roughly 1,000 years and were constantly staging revolts. So, 10 years as compared to 1,000 years is nothing at all, right? And they also fought the French and died then. So that the Vietnamese view of themselves is as fierce nationalists fighting off foreign invaders. And the French certainly qualify along those lines. Yeah.
So I got two. One is a very interesting connection is if you talk about Baltimore, you talk about Ferguson. If you talk about Baltimore, you talk about Ferguson.
Yeah.
You talk about the inter-racism around Southeast Asia and how that interacted, and you talk about Gaza. It really shows that this day and age that the military-industrial complex is, at the core of it, is a racist system. Your comment on that? And the second part is, how from your perspective, from your YouTube perspective, how do you talk about intra-racism within the societies, within the Vietnamese, Thai, Cambodian, how the Uyghurs are treated in China, and all that stuff?
Yeah, well, they didn't deal so much with the foreign inter-racism, but they certainly dealt persistently, frequently, constantly with the racism here in the country and connected the anti-war effort. And if one person mentioned Baltimore, they all did. I mean, the underlying message of the whole conference came from Martin Luther King's 1967 speech, where he spoke out against the war. One of the very, very first speakers of the event mentioned that, and it constantly was quoted again. And if you know, or you want to read your history, Martin Luther King was attacked both by mainstream press and from within the civil rights movement itself for taking a stand against the war. What Martin Luther King said is the thing that we so much, this is a theme today, we say no justice, no peace. Martin Luther King says there's no true peace without eliminating all the causes for war, which are poverty, racism, and the other social ills of our country and the world. And so that was repeated throughout, and I didn't really represent that as what was going on at the conference, but it was that the struggles that we are having now are the same struggles as the anti-war struggles back then. They're all of one piece, And someone may be working on gender issues in here, someone may be working on Palestinian issues over there, somebody may be working on racism here in this country, but it's all part of the same struggle, and we all can't work on all the issues all the time. You have to find your spot. One, Joe Comerford from MoveOn.org said, there's a role in the movement for everyone. So you may not be a leader, you may just lick stamps, or you don't lick stamps anymore. You may take stamps, but that's your role. That's your role. That's your role. So it doesn't really address your question specifically that way, but I wanted to make that point that the conference was more than just about, oh, aren't we wonderful in Vietnam? As Juan Gonzalez said, some of you in this audience have been waiting 50 years to be told you were right.
Just to add something to that, I don't want to sound totally cynical here, but it seems to me that while this country is a very racist society in many ways, and certainly has a history to go with that, from slavery to Jim Crow on, the fact is that that facilitated the military-industrial complex. It didn't drive it, it seems to me. That is, U.S. officials and the people behind them who wanted the Vietnam War and who kept it going, I don't think were driven by racism. I think they were driven by power, the struggle for power around the world, and by greed, and the society frequently supported that, thanks to the fact that the American people, or at least a good chunk of the American population, were happy to kill Vietnamese and hated them and regarded them as subhuman. But I think we can see that cynicism of policymakers coming out today in this détente with Vietnam, right? That is the same people they were once killing happily, they're happy to deal with now if they're to be used against China, or if they're to be part of the worldwide capitalist economic system. If they play the game, if they support the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that I think that while racism is certainly a very strong force in American life, I think the people who run the military-industrial complex in the United States are willing to use it, but I don't think that they're fundamentally driven by it. Oh, and the last point, many Asian societies have minority groups within them. Vietnam has, I'm trying to remember the number, I believe it's 54 minority groups. And they're quite different than the dominant group there. They have a colorful garb, which they wear on ceremonial occasions, and in fact wore for that parade you saw. I just didn't show those photos. And China does too. The Uyghurs, who are a Muslim minority compared to the dominant Han Chinese, are very much mistreated by the Chinese government. The Chinese government arranged for nuclear tests to be held on Uyghur territory, for example. So there are problems of racism there too. I think, though, in Vietnam, they're far less severe, and the minority peoples have been fairly well integrated into the dominant culture. Other questions? Yes?
Yes, so I think I heard you say that you wondered whether the Vietnamese Revolution was worth it. And
That question is certainly raised by seeing what's happening.
but I mean, I'm not sure there was an alternative at the time. I mean, when you have occupying forces in your country, first the French and then the Americans, it seems like that was, was obviously the right thing to do to assert their national independence. And the fact that it didn't come out to be a perfect country, I don't think means that there was any questioning of whether or not it was right for them to have a revolution, right for us to oppose it.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that there was no justification for the revolution, but I did mean to say that in hindsight, the remarkable thing is that these two countries, with the two systems still in place, right? Communist Vietnam, right, versus a capitalist United States, were massacring one another en masse for so long and so horribly, and yet today they get on just fine. So the question is, could that have been avoided? It seems to me it certainly could have been by the United States. Maybe it could have been avoided by Vietnam. It's not clear. I should point out Ho Chi Minh, to go back to the Second World War, during the Second World War, the U.S. government parachuted in Office of Strategic Services troops, officers, to help the Viet Minh, to help the communist revolutionaries led by Ho Chi Minh to resist the Japanese and the French collaborators. And after the war, Ho sought to keep that alliance going. The U.S. forces trained the Viet Minh. They saved Ho's life when he was near death. So Ho sought to keep that friendly relationship going, but he failed. Truman didn't respond to his 5 or 6 letters that he sent to President Truman. Maybe there could have been some kind of deal worked out at that time. The U.S. government didn't go for it, of course, at that point. But one wonders, in hindsight, at least, and maybe it's too much hindsight and not putting oneself back in that situation, whether something could not have been worked out had the two sides been willing to say, well, you know, we could get along in the world. We did during the Second World War. A communist revolution doesn't necessarily mean X, Y, and Z. It doesn't necessarily mean that will be a Soviet satellite. How about that? We don't know. That route wasn't followed. And it may well be that it would have been unsuccessful. It was when Ho tried it. Yes?
Did the United States compensate Vietnam for the massive destruction and death that spread over there? And secondly, what is the attitude of the average Vietnamese person towards this country?
Okay. The United States has not compensated Vietnam in any way for damages to its country or for payments to Agent Orange victims or unexploded ordnance victims. It is putting some money in the last few years into the cleanup of these things. The 72 or 73, I guess 72 agreement that was signed with Vietnam, that was the official end of the U.S. war, at least drawing U.S. troops out of Vietnam at that point, did provide for compensation to the Vietnamese. But the Nixon administration simply ignored that. It never followed through on that. And the Vietnamese asked for it, but they never got it. And bad feelings today. We were told by government officials that among the older generation, there are still some bad feelings toward the United States. But that the younger generation is very sympathetic toward the United States. They like American products, they like those motor scooters and various other things. And so for a good percentage of the population, there are simply no bad feelings. And again, when one compares the American war to the other wars Vietnam has fought, the American war is a very small part of Vietnam's war-torn history.
I've spoken with some veterans who have gone over there to Vietnam. There are regular trips. Veterans for Peace has an annual trip to Vietnam, and other groups go over sort of as healing for the veterans from the Vietnam War. And universally, what I hear from them is they've met with other soldiers that they've probably even fought against at the time, and they're there is no bad feelings in the sense that they understand they were both doing the job they had to do at the time. It was regrettable, it shouldn't have happened, but they greet each other as comrades.
Yes.
Well, I was wondering, but maybe I'm misremembering this. I thought there was supposed to be an election, 19, whatever.
54.
Before, and it didn't happen. And would that have been part of what you were saying about the possibility?
Oh, well, that was foreclosed by the United States. I believe the Geneva Conference was 54 and the election was supposed to be 56, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And so the French pulled out, gave up their war. The Americans hadn't moved in yet. But once the French pulled out and Vietnam was divided into two zones, there was supposed to be an election in 1956 in both halves of Vietnam that would choose a government and reunite the country. That never took place thanks to the fact that the U.S. government moved into the South determined to prop it up as an anti-communist nation.
So what do you think would have happened if there'd been the election?
Well, Eisenhower says in his memoirs that Ho Chi Minh would have gotten 80% of the vote, and that's why the U.S. government didn't want to let it take place. Yes.
I want to know about historical accounts and memoirs from the Vietnamese side. Are you aware of other independent Vietnamese historians who have written about the American War from the Vietnamese point of view? Are there memoirs of Vietnamese who have written about the war from the Vietnamese point of view? Or is it more an official history that's promulgated?
I have a list right here. Something McCarthy, right? That's right. This two-sided piece of paper I got at the panel on poets and writers about the Vietnam War. And one side is American writers, and the other side, and you can see it's a long list covering one side of this page, is Vietnamese writers. Some of these are novels, some of them are memoirs, some of it's poetry. A lot of it's being published now by people, and so there is quite a literature that's available. And I think there's a lot that's in Vietnamese that has been translated. So if you're interested, Gene, I can make you a copy of this list.
Well, I would think that if we have these commemorations and these panel discussions and all, that we would invite Vietnamese to get their point of view,
That's a
and
nice.
not just an American.
No, that's a great idea. Let me say this. Sitting at the conference, I was saying to myself, so what can I do in my little world here in Albany to carry on this for the next 10 years or so? Deo Valente. And what I'm planning to do is I'm planning to invite poets and writers who are veterans who have written about the Vietnamese War from their experiences. And some of you know I organize poetry readings and other literary events around town. And so I'm planning on a regular basis to bring folks in to the community and have something like this, and you can talk to them. And I will explore this, Gene, through those contacts and see if there's a Vietnamese writers I can include. So thanks for that suggestion.
You hear me on the phone?
Yeah, in a minute. Oh. Well, or should I do it at the very end? At the very end. Let me do it at the very end, David.
Yeah, I think it's worth, 50 years later, we're talking about the changing influence of the military-industrial complex, to note this fundamental transformation that's occurred in our society as a result of this war. I mean, remember how the military said, oh, never again, we'll never do it like Vietnam again, Colin Powell and the going in Iraq. Well, what changed fundamentally was the draft. I mean, we don't have the draft anymore. We all hated the draft. But when we had a draft, that war came home into everybody's communities, into everybody's homes. Now it's not. It was volunteer military. you know, we can go wage wars wherever we want, anywhere in the world, and nobody's talking about it at home. No, you know, what really effective peace movement is there? None, because, you know, hate is not real for most people anymore. That's maybe a fundamental legacy that we have to deal with.
Well, I counter that, your remark, though, there's no peace movement. I think there is. And I think it still exists. It manifests itself in many different ways. But one of the differences I'd like to point out from the 60s is when we had these big anti-war marches, they were in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, Washington, D.C. Now, and we've been in a 10-year war now, more than 10 years. I travel around the country, I look for two things. I look for poetry readings and I look for peace vigils. And I find both, no matter where I've been. And so, you know, like here in Del Mar, and on Monday nights, there may be 3-4 people standing on a corner, but they're there every Monday night, and speaking to hundreds of people who drive by. And then throughout the country, there are these little vigils. You do one in Skodak every week, I know. And there's Chatham, and there's Saratoga, and right in our area on a weekly basis. That's different. And so what happened after the Vietnam War, people have spread out throughout the country. And I think that's much better, because you need to speak to your own communities, not just these big, you need the big marches. I'm all for the big marches. But we need the regular, ongoing actions, visible actions in our community that speak to the ordinary people that drive by, that are busy with their kids, picking them up for soccer and all that kind of stuff. And they see you every week or on a regular basis, and they know you're their neighbor. And I think that's a very, very powerful anti-war statement. Let's go to half-past Larry, and we'll have another question or two. And that way we can, you know, get literature, have newspapers. Veterans for Peace has a new newspaper out called A Peace in Our Time, so please take a copy of that. Back there in the corner?
Yeah. I think in addition to the draft, something else that really brought the Vietnam War home for us was all the media coverage. You saw the horrors when you turned on the news. You saw the body bags. I realize we're not supposed to call them body bags anymore, but you know, you saw it front and center. And many days we don't even get any news that would imply we're doing anything at all in Afghanistan or Iraq or all the other places where we're murdering people. And, well, Snowden showed us some of the stuff, and look what our government, you know, did to him. I'm very concerned that the historical amnesia, I like that phrase, by the way, is picture 50 years from when we started each of those wars. The historical amnesia is going to be almost total. It's pretty bad right now. And my question related to that is picture 50 years from the start of, well, you can pick whatever war we're in, all right, Iraq, Afghanistan, whatever, and picture a conference 50 years from now. And how do you think that would play out, if at all?
Well, I think in some ways the conference that we're talking about here tonight is, maybe that's a clue, because we were in the same situation back then during the Vietnam War. We were dealing with protests against it, and we were fighting fighting the good fight. We didn't know, as many of the speakers indicated, we didn't know we would be gathering together 50 years later to talk about it again, and talk about it as a context, not that it was over, but the fight continues again, like I say, for all these other issues that affect our society. You know, no justice, no peace. You know, and until we get that justice, until we eliminate those things in our society that make it possible to conduct war, we will continue to have wars. So I think we can project to the next 50 years and say that hopefully either the wars will be over and everyone will be living in peace and harmony, I can hope, or we will have other progressive activist people speaking out, attending a meeting like this, and continuing the struggle.
Just to add to that, The institution of war goes back many thousands of years. People have been slaughtering one another and doing that with on a lower technological level for a great deal of time. And the technology has enabled the wars to become fiercer and nastier over time. Nonetheless, as the wars have grown more devastating, peace movements have emerged. Peace movements don't go back thousands of years. They go back roughly 200 years now to 1815, when the first American Peace Society was formed. So while 200 years may seem to you like a long time, in fact, in humanity's history, it's a fairly short time. So you are part of that transformation of the world from a society, a world accepting war as a normal course of events, to a society that is rejecting war increasingly, in which there are peace movements around the world that are protesting, that are contesting this resort to war, and in the end, that resistance may be successful. It depends on whether you join peace movements, whether you're active in peace movements, what you do from this point on. So I do hope you'll become involved.
This guy's had his hand up like.
Okay, we'll do one more question. It's half past. That'll give us time to pick up some literature. We can talk informally too. So go ahead.
Have other enemies of Vietnam had the technology to use Agent Orange and to leave dangerous explosives in Vietnam? And second question, in the last 40 years since the Vietnamese War ended, has the Vietnamese government asked the American government to return to Vietnam to clean up its mess?
We have a couple copies of The Nation, and one of them, I picked up the wrong one, but there have been articles very recently about the effort by people, generally non-governmental organizations, to go into Vietnam and to clean this stuff up and do it. Not officially by the United States government, unfortunately. And we were the only ones who did it. I mean, there was more bombs dropped in one city in Vietnam than were dropped in Europe in World War II at one point. It's huge damage to their country, and which will continue. And the Agent Orange affected not only the Vietnamese. I had a personal friend who died in the VA hospital here in Albany because of his service in Vietnam in an area that was being sprayed with Agent Orange. He talked about loading these canisters, just picking them up, being stuff sprayed on him from planes, and he died of cancer, very horrible cancer, as a result of that. So, we did it. Not we. All right, let's end here, and I'm sorry we don't have questions. Ask me later. All right?
I just wanted to say one thing about Agent Orange and the chemical company Monsanto that makes Agent Orange. And there's a whole worldwide movement to fight against Monsanto and a lot of these chemical companies that are now modifying our food. And so May 23rd, not this Saturday, next Saturday, there is 8 different locations around the state and millions of people worldwide that are marching against Monsanto. And so the Capitol, I invite you guys to come, 1 o'clock, Capitol, May 23rd.
It's only $1, like a Capitol. And this relates directly to Vietnam. This is dedicated to Hugh Thompson Jr. And we talk about the My Lai massacre, but one of the things to keep in mind is American soldiers stopped that massacre. They were a helicopter crew. Hugh Thompson Jr. was a member of that crew. There were 2 others in the crew, and unfortunately, I don't have the name in front of me. But he was one of them, and they flew their helicopter right down, landed it in between the troops and the villagers. They turned their rifles on their fellow soldiers to get them to stop the killing. Now, It had already been going on for a while, so, and then they made 3 trips to bring wounded to hospitals. Hugh Thompson Jr. was one of them. He died a few years ago. So I wrote this poem for Hugh Thompson Jr., and it also talks about you. We are just ordinary people, living in ordinary times, meeting face to face with other ordinary people. Across the gulf of extraordinary evil, we are just men and women facing each other with guns in our hands, with pens, hammers, screwdrivers, brushes, and keyboards, doing what this moment calls for us to do across the gulf of extraordinary evil, to become heroes in ordinary times. Go out and be heroes, all right? Oh, yeah, Memorial Day Parade is Monday, May 25th. In Albany, Veterans for Peace is marching once again. If you would like to join us, the parade starts at 9:30. We'll be gathering at 9 o'clock on the corner of Central Avenue and Carter Street. Feel free to join us to march in the parade with Veterans for Peace. Bring signs urging peace and the end of war, and remembering the dead, all the dead, civilian and soldiers of the war. All right. Any questions about that? You can see it.
No.